She ran until her breath burned and her boots bled. The wedding veil she'd torn free now trailed behind her like a flag of surrender, snagging on branches, soaked with snow. Behind her, the sound of hooves still echoed, distant now, but not gone. Eliza didn't know how far she'd come, only that the trail kept rising, colder with every step. The hills were thick with pines, and somewhere far below, her father's men were still searching, still calling her name like it belonged to them. But the snow answered louder. It muffled the world and swallowed her tracks. When she found the abandoned shepherd's hut tucked beneath a rocky overhang, she collapsed inside without thought. The door hung crooked on rusted hinges. There was no fire, no warmth, only dust, cobwebs, and quiet. She curled in a corner and held the baby shoes beneath her coat, the only thing she'd taken with her that wasn't out of fear. They were meant for the child she'd lost, the child her betrothed had called an inconvenience. Now she had nothing but the ache of him and the cold crawling up her spine. Night came quickly. So did the howling. At first she thought it was the wind, but when she peered through a crack in the door, she saw it. A silver-furred wolf sitting at the tree line, unmoving, its yellow eyes fixed on the hut. She jerked back, heart racing. It didn't leave. The next morning it was still there. She stayed hidden, clutching her coat tighter, praying it would lose interest. But it returned each dusk, silent and still, like a sentinel waiting for something she didn't understand. On the third night, Eliza lit the last of her matches, warming her hands over a pitiful flame. Her lips were cracked. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. When the wind knocked the door open wide, she didn't even flinch. The wolf stood just beyond it, watching. Not snarling, not stepping closer, just waiting. Behind him, the trees shifted. A darker shape moved between them, tall, human, quiet. She couldn't make out the face, but the posture was calm, unafraid. When Eliza finally stood, her knees buckled. She stumbled to the door, one hand on the frame, and looked at the wolf one last time. "Why won't you go?" she whispered. The answer came not in words, but in warmth. The man stepped forward, caught her as she fell. She didn't even see his face, only felt the strength in his arms and the heat of a fire she hadn't lit. Then everything went black and peaceful. She woke to warmth, a fire crackling low, the scent of pine and leather, and something cooking over stone. For a moment, Eliza thought she'd dreamed the whole thing, but when she stirred, the ache in her limbs reminded her she hadn't. She was wrapped in furs, not her own. The hut was no longer empty. A heavy woven blanket hung over the drafty doorway, and beside the fire, the silver wolf lay curled with its eyes half open. She sat up slowly, dizzy, and then she saw him. The man. He knelt near, the fire, back turned, adding thin slices of dried meat into a small clay pot. Tall, broad-shouldered, his dark braids hung over a fur-lined coat worn from hard years. When he turned to glance at her, his face was lean, deeply lined, but not unkind. A scar ran down his temple, but it did nothing to lessen the calm in his eyes. He gave a slow nod, acknowledgement, not intrusion, and returned to the stew. He didn't ask questions. He didn't touch her. And he didn't speak. She wrapped the furs tighter and watched him in silence, too weak to flee and too uncertain to thank him. The wolf yawned and rose, padding over to nuzzle the man's knee. He scratched its ears without looking. Hours passed. He handed her a carved wooden bowl and returned to his side of the fire. The food was simple: meat, roots, bitter herbs, but it warmed her in places the snow never should have touched. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked. "Why did you come?" He didn't answer. She tried again. Did someone send you?" Still nothing. But then he pointed, not at her, but at the wolf. She blinked. "He found me?" The man nodded once. "Why?" she asked. Her voice trembled. "I'm not worth saving." He stirred the coals with a stick and looked at her for a long moment. Then, from his coat, he pulled a small bundle wrapped in hide and passed it to her. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a tiny silver bracelet, Comanche made. Etched into it was a feather and a spiral. She recognized it instantly. Years ago, she had stitched a wound on a young Comanche boy left to die after a settler raid. He hadn't spoken then either. But he'd taken her hand, just once, and left her that bracelet in thanks. Her eyes shot up to meet the man's. His expression hadn't changed, but his silence said more than words ever could. He remembered. He had watched. And now, when no one else had come, he had. Not to save her, but to return a kindness never forgotten. The next morning, Eliza stepped outside the hut for the first time since she'd collapsed. The cold bit her cheeks, but it wasn't cruel anymore. It just reminded her she was still alive. The wolf stood nearby, watching her but not moving, as if waiting for her to understand something deeper. The man, she still didn't know his name, had already gone. His footprints led into the woods, flanked by the wolf's. She wanted to stay inside, wrapped in furs and forgetting the world, but something about the stillness tugged at her. She followed the tracks. They weren't hard to read. The snow was fresh, and he walked like someone who knew the land. Long, confident strides, never wasting a step. She walked carefully, her breath catching at each sound, half expecting her father's men to leap from the trees. But the forest held only the sound of her own heartbeat and the crunch of snow beneath her boots. After 20 minutes, she spotted him. He knelt at the edge of a frozen stream, studying something in the snow. When he heard her, he didn't startle. He simply rose and stepped aside so she could see. Hoofprints, 3 sets, big ones, wagon tracks, too. Her breath caught. "They're still looking for me," she whispered. He nodded once, then knelt and smoothed a hand over the tracks. He pointed southeast, the way the prints led, then back toward the hut. His eyes asked the question he didn't speak. "Do you want to run?" She wanted to scream yes, but her legs didn't move. She stared down the trail. "They'll never stop," she said. "Even if I keep going, they'll find me." He didn't argue. He simply picked up a stick and drew something in the snow, a small circle surrounded by lines, trees, hills, protection, a hidden place. Then he drew another. A box, bars like a cage, the settlement. The decision was hers. Her throat tightened. "I don't even know your name," she said softly. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat and handed her a folded strip of hide. When she unwrapped it, she found a single braid of her own hair, cut and tied with red twine. Her breath caught. That had been years ago. She had cut it during a Comanche funeral rite to honor the child who had died in her care. The boy had watched from the trees, wounded and silent. She never thought he'd remembered. She looked at him now, grown, strong, silent still, and suddenly the fear inside her loosened. She didn't have to run anymore. She had been found. And for the first time, she wasn't alone. That night, the fire inside the hut burned brighter than it had before. Eliza sat wrapped in her own thoughts, staring into the flames while the wolf lay beside the doorway like a sentinel. The man worked in silence, carving something from bone with long, patient strokes. Outside, the snow deepened, and the forest closed in like a secret. She couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her father's face twisted in fury, the preacher's hand clutching the marriage papers, and the whip coiled at the outlaw's waist, ready to break her for daring to say no. They hadn't wanted a daughter or a wife. They'd wanted a transaction, a tool, and when she'd run, she hadn't just escaped the wedding, she'd ruined their deal. "They'll kill me," she whispered, not to him, but to the fire. "If they find me." The man didn't reply, but after a moment he reached behind him and placed something in front of her. It was a small leather pouch, worn with time. She opened it slowly, and inside found crushed berries, black ash, and a dried root she recognized from stories. War paint, Comanche symbols of protection and mourning. She looked at him, confused. He nodded to her, then to himself. She understood. "You are not invisible. You are seen, and you are not unguarded." Her eyes welled, not from fear this time, but from something harder to hold. Acceptance. He wasn't asking her to fight. He was offering to stand between her and the storm. She reached for the pouch, and with trembling fingers drew a line of ash across her own cheek, just as she'd seen the women do when they lost someone. But this wasn't for loss. It was for what she had chosen to leave behind. He met her gaze, then touched the same ash to his forehead. An equal vow. The wolf let out a soft breath and settled down. Later, while the wind howled beyond the walls, Eliza finally asked, "Why didn't you forget me?" He didn't move. But slowly he took something from his neck, a worn strip of hide strung with a carved bead. He placed it beside her hand. "You gave this to my sister," he said quietly, the first words she'd heard him speak, "when no one else would touch her." Eliza stared at the bead. She remembered the girl, burned in a settler raid, cast out, left to die. Eliza had wrapped her wounds, sung to her as she passed. She said your hands were the last warmth she felt. Eliza bowed her head, tears falling into the firelight. No words came, but none were needed. Not now. Not between them. Not with the fire still burning. The next morning, Eliza rose before the man did. The fire had gone to embers, but warmth lingered in the space they'd shared. She moved quietly, stepping out into the pale light that filtered through the snow-covered trees. The wolf trailed her steps but kept its distance, more shadow than beast, more guardian than hunter. Her cheeks still bore the faint streaks of ash, and somehow she didn't wipe them away. They had become part of her now, an oath she hadn't known she was ready to make. The forest was silent except for the soft hush of wind through pine. She walked until the hut was barely visible behind her, needing space to think. Kneeling near a frozen stream, she stared into the ice and saw herself. Not the obedient daughter, not the runaway bride, but something new. Her eyes looked older, her mouth set harder. She dipped her hands into the snow and let it numb her fingers. The cold no longer scared her. Behind her, a twig snapped. She turned fast, but it wasn't the man. It was the wolf again, watching from a rise, and just behind it, hoof prints, not his, deeper, wider, fresher. Her breath caught. She crouched beside them, pressing a hand to the indentation. Then another sound reached her. Distant voices, faint but carried by the stillness. Male, English, 2, maybe 3. Her father's men? Bounty riders? Her blood turned cold. She stood, heart pounding, and ran back to the hut. He was already outside, crouched near the fire pit, examining the same tracks. When he looked up, his face said everything. They'd found the ridge. She didn't wait for a plan. "We need to leave," she said, but he shook his head. He pointed up toward the high ridge, too steep for a wagon. Then he gestured again. "Stay hidden. Let them pass." But she shook her head. They'll see the smoke. He hesitated. Then, with quiet purpose, he began gathering the blankets, the dried meat, the bone-carved tools he'd made. Eliza helped. There were no words between them now, only movement. He handed her a curved blade and motioned for her to keep it hidden. Then he lifted a wooden board in the floor, revealing a dugout below, small but dry, covered with pine needles and bark. A hiding place. She climbed down, and he covered it, placing the firewood over top as if nothing lay beneath. Darkness swallowed her. She could hear the crunch of his boots above her, the soft breath of the wolf beside the fire. And then, voices. Closer now, harsh, demanding, the unmistakable tone of men used to being obeyed. Eliza pressed her hands over her mouth to keep from crying out. They were here, and this time, she couldn't run. The muffled voices above her grew louder, sharper, filled with suspicion and impatience. Eliza crouched in the cold darkness beneath the floor, heart pounding so loud she feared they could hear it. A splinter pressed into her palm, but she didn't move. She didn't even breathe. One of the men outside barked, "You seen a girl?" Pale, thin, about this tall. Ran off wearing a wedding dress like a fool? Another voice chimed in, cruel and laughing. "Should have broken her in sooner. She'd be walking different, not running off like a wild filly." Eliza closed her eyes, bile rising in her throat. She recognized them. Her father's foreman, and worse, her would-be groom's older brother. Both had cornered her before. Both had said things no woman should ever have to hear. Above her, the mountain man gave no answer. The silence stretched, heavy as a storm. Then the first man snapped, "I asked you a question, Redskin. You deaf or just dumb?" Still nothing. Then came a thud, boots pushing through snow, stepping closer. "You got a woman's tracks around here, light ones, fresh. Don't lie to me." Another pause. The wolf let out a low growl, and she heard the man curse. "Keep your beast back." "She's not here," the Comanche man said at last, voice flat. "She passed through, gone now." His English was low, clipped. Eliza bit her lip. It wasn't a lie, not exactly. One man laughed. "Maybe we'll take a look anyway." That's when the second voice shifted, colder now. "No fire should burn this warm if you're alone. What are you hiding?" Silence again. Then came a sound she hadn't expected. A sudden impact, a body hitting the snow. The wolf barked. A shout followed. Metal scraped from a scabbard. Eliza's fingers curled around the small blade he had given her. Her entire body shook, not from cold, but from fury. They'd come for her again. They always came. But this time, she wasn't going to be carried back like stolen cattle. She waited, listened. Another crash. Then quiet. Long quiet. Snowfall kind of quiet. Then the board above her creaked. A hand reached down, not rough, not forceful, but steady. She took it. The mountain man pulled her out slowly, carefully, and set her on her feet. Her eyes scanned the clearing. No one else was there, just tracks leading away into the trees, red streaks smeared in the white. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The wolf sat beside him again, ears alert, tail still, and for the first time in her life, Eliza felt something close to justice. Not revenge, just survival. With teeth. They left before sunrise. The fire was doused, the hut abandoned for good. Eliza didn't ask where they were going. She only knew they had to keep moving. The mountain man led, silent as ever, and the wolf circled the trail behind them like a second set of eyes. Snow fell soft and steady, cloaking the world in silence, erasing the blood trail as quickly as it had appeared. It was as if the confrontation from the night before had been swallowed whole by the mountain. Eliza kept pace, though her legs ached and her shoulders burned beneath the pack he'd strapped on her. She didn't complain. She didn't want to slow him down. He was leading her somewhere that mattered. She could feel it. Midday came and went. They didn't speak, but something passed between them in glances and gestures, a language built on trust. At one point, he stopped beside a fallen pine and waited for her to catch up. He pointed to the bark, where a strip had been peeled and notched. "Marked," she said softly, realizing. "They're tracking us?" He shook his head. Then he pointed higher, towards the cliffside. A narrow ledge wound up and around, nearly invisible. She understood. He was taking them through the high pass, where horses couldn't follow. She nodded and followed him upward. Hours passed, wind picked up, and the ledge narrowed to a shoulder's width. Below, the world dropped into white nothingness. She hugged the rock and didn't dare look down. The wolf went first, fearless. The mountain man moved with steady grace, and when her boot slipped once, he turned fast, catching her wrist before she could cry out. His grip was solid, warm through the cold. He didn't let go until she was standing firm again. At the summit, the land opened up, pine valleys below, and beyond them, smoke curling from a hidden camp far in the trees. Her breath caught. "Yours?" she asked. He hesitated, then nodded. "Safe?" she asked. "For you?" His answer was a quiet, "Yes." That single word landed heavier than any vow she'd ever heard. She turned to him then, truly turned, and took in his face, not just the scars or the silence, but the steadiness that lived in his eyes. "Thank you," she said, voice thick. He looked away, almost uncomfortable with praise. But then he did something unexpected. He took a strip of leather from his wrist and gently tied it around her palm. A warrior's token. Protection. Belonging. Eliza didn't know if it meant she was one of them now, but she knew as the sun dipped low and the smoke from the camp grew closer. She wasn't running anymore. She was being welcomed. And the girl who'd once begged for freedom was now walking straight into it. They reached the edge of the hidden Comanche camp by nightfall. Unlike the settlements Eliza had known, rowdy, prying, full of suspicion, this place breathed in quiet rhythm with the land. Tents made of hide and driftwood nestled against a frozen stream, smoke curling from low fires, children's laughter echoing faintly from beyond the trees. And yet, no one ran to greet them. No one pointed or whispered. Instead, the people glanced up and simply nodded, as if her arrival wasn't a surprise but an expected part of some older story. The mountain man led her toward one of the larger shelters, the wolf still trotting at his heels. A woman with gray braids stepped out. Her eyes flicked over Eliza, taking in the tattered dress, the hollow cheeks, the ash still faint on her skin. But she didn't scowl or question. She simply extended her hand and placed it on Eliza's chest, just above the heart. "You walked far," the elder said softly. "Hard paths burn away the lie." Eliza couldn't answer. Her throat tightened, and all she could do was nod. Inside the shelter, warmth wrapped her like a long-lost memory. Blankets, carved bowls, a shallow basin of warm water. The mountain man set down her bundle but didn't enter. He stood at the flap and spoke in his native tongue to the elder, who listened carefully. Then he turned to leave. Eliza stood quickly. "You're not staying?" He looked at her, and for the first time since they met, he smiled. Small, fleeting, but real. "You're safe now," he said. "I have to see where the storm moves." She understood. He needed to ensure the men who hunted her had truly turned back. She stepped forward, hands trembling. "I don't even know your name," she said, And you saved me." He paused, eyes softening. "Kohana," he said. "It means swift." Then, with a final nod to the elder, he disappeared into the trees. That night, Eliza lay in the circle of warmth, listening to the soft sounds of the camp. For the first time in weeks, she didn't flinch in her sleep. The elder had placed a braided cord at her feet, a gesture of protection and welcome. Children whispered nearby, curious but not cruel. She was no longer a hunted bride or a disobedient daughter. Here, no one asked her past. No one needed to. The ashes on her skin, the silent man's gift, and the wolf's watchful eyes had spoken for her. In the dark, as the fire crackled low, she whispered his name, Kohana, and let it settle into the hollow spaces of her spirit, not as a plea, but as a promise. Eliza awoke to the scent of cedar smoke and the gentle hum of morning sounds, wood being split, water fetched from the stream, and voices speaking softly in a language not her own. The camp pulsed with quiet purpose, a rhythm she had never known in the rigid world she'd come from. A young girl brought her a bowl of warm cornmeal, smiled, and left without asking questions. It struck Eliza how strange it felt to simply exist without being watched, judged, or expected to speak. She sat outside the shelter, soaking in the frost-bitten sunlight, when the elder woman returned and knelt beside her. "He walks with the wind," she said, "but the wind carries whispers." Eliza stiffened. "What kind of whispers?" The woman pointed to the ridge. "Smoke, not ours." Eliza stood, eyes straining towards the far tree line. A thin curl of gray twisted into the sky, too sharp, too deliberate. Her heart sank. "They found us." The elder didn't answer. She didn't need to. Kohana had not returned. He had left before sunrise 2 days ago, and Eliza had tried to believe he would come back, but now that belief frayed. Still, something in her refused to wait behind again. "I want to help," she said. The woman studied her, then stood and led her to a low tent at the camp's edge. Inside were furs, herbs, hunting tools, and a bow. Not polished or ornamental, but lean and scarred, worn from years of use. Eliza reached for it. Her hands weren't steady, but she remembered the feel of it. She'd hunted as a child before her father forbade it. "This belonged to the one who wore the ash before you," the elder said. "She fought to protect what couldn't run." Eliza's fingers curled tighter around the grip. "Then I will do the same." She set out before the sun cleared the trees. The wolf joined her, moving through the snow like breath. Together they climbed the ridge in silence. The smoke grew thicker, and soon she saw it. 3 men gathered near a fire at the edge of a ravine. One wore her father's old riding coat. Another had the same wide hat as the man who'd tried to buy her silence with gold rings and a wedding contract. They weren't just looking, they were waiting, but not for her, for Kohana. Her breath caught. That meant he was close, or worse, already seen. She crouched low, scanning the woods. Then she saw him. Blood at his temple, hands tied, being dragged toward the fire. Her vision tunneled. The wolf growled low. Eliza didn't think. She notched the arrow and stepped from the trees. This time she wouldn't run. This time, they would. Eliza stepped into the clearing like she'd done it 100 times in her dreams. Bow raised, hair wild, the wolf pacing beside her like death on 4 legs. The men froze, not because of her weapon, but because of her eyes. There was no fear in them now, only fury carved from silence and the weight of everything they'd taken. "Let him go," she said. Her voice didn't shake. One man laughed. "Look what wandered down from the ridge. You think that twig'll stop me?" She loosed the arrow without answering. It struck the ground inches from his boot, hard enough to split bark. The wolf snarled and lunged, circling. The second man reached for his gun, but by the time he drew, Kohana had already moved. Eliza hadn't seen how, only that suddenly his wrists were free and his captor was choking on his own breath. Chaos erupted. The man with the gun fired. Missed. Eliza ran. The wolf leapt. Kohana tackled the last man into the fire, then dragged him out and left him coughing in the snow. It was over in seconds, but Eliza couldn't stop shaking. Her knees buckled. Kohana caught her. They didn't speak for a long time. Just breathed. Just existed. Eventually she pulled back, looking down at the men groaning in the dirt. "Do we kill them?" she asked. Her voice cracked. Kohana stood, eyes flat, but then he shook his head. "Number let the cold do it." He picked up one of their horses, slapped it hard to scatter them, and turned back towards the trees. Eliza didn't ask where they were going. She followed. They returned to the ridge by nightfall, but not to the camp. The people had moved, as planned, deep into the valley. Kohana led her to a smaller shelter near the stream, built just for them. There was no ceremony, no words, just wood and warmth, and the comfort of knowing no one was coming to take her away again. That night she sat by the fire and watched him carve a new bow, one smaller, lighter. He handed it to her. "Yours," he said. Just that. She touched the smooth wood, and for the first time saw her future not as a question, but as a story still unfolding. One where she wasn't a burden, or a bride, or a runaway. She was a fighter, a healer, a woman with ash still streaked faint on her cheek. Outside, the snow kept falling, but inside the fire burned steady, not to keep the dark away, but to remind her it never had the power to claim her in the first place.